This is the end-all be-all of content surrounding EVGA's VRM temperatures. We attach thermocouple probes directly to the PCB's backside hotspot to MOSFETs number 2 and 7, which are commonly shown scorched in photos of defective cards. And we ran dozens of tests ranging from optimistic use case scenarios to completely unrealistic torture tests. Testing was done with and without thermal pads, and also with and without the VBIOS update, and with a stock unmodified card as well. Today we're showing a closer look at EVGA's 10 series ACX 3.0 cooler thermal issues. Buildzoid from actually Hardcore Overclocking will be joining me about halfway through. Before getting to that, this content is brought to you by our Patreon backers. So you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/GamersNexus, to help us out directly and to help us fund in-depth testing like this, which is frankly impossible to make money off of because it took so much time. Keep in mind that everything here is exhaustively discussed in the article as well, linked in the description below. There are more charts there, a good amount more, but there's still a ton here. So there's plenty of content to consume. The goal is to sort of finish the book on the EVGA thermal analysis and discussion and see if these potential posted online board failures are a result of thermals, as sort of initial testing suggested, or something else. Let's recap the basics again. We recently validated a Tom's Hardware test which suggested that EVGA ACX devices were heating up on the backside of the VRM to north of 100 Celsius. Note that VRMs, though, can handle 100 C no problem, but the temperatures that Tom's had shown, hitting 114 C in some reports and using thermal imaging, were beginning to enter the range of being concerning. The fact that a few users began sharing photos around this time of scorched PCBs furthered this concern of temperature-related damage to EVGA cards, and we validated Tom's Hardware DE's testing methodology by deploying our own thermal camera just like they did, but noted that emissivity and the delta between the backside of the PCB and the front side VRMs could be significant. So we decided thermal imaging wasn't sufficient, even though we did validate their results using that methodology, and EVGA then issued thermal pad mods, optionally, and a VBIOS update that increased the aggression of the fan speed curve. We declared at this point that both of these, by way of thermal imaging, were enough to fix the problem. And until today, this problem was largely assumed to be because of EVGA's lack of thermal pads between the base plate and the heatsink, and then on the back side of the card, between the back plate and the back of the PCB, the thermal pad that was later added in the thermal mod goes right here and covers the backside of the inductors, the power stages, capacitor banks, things like that. But we found more. There's more to it than that. So the thermals are not the heart of the issue here. In our testing, we apply K-type thermocouples to 3 spots. One of them is the back of the PCB, which on a back plate would be right around where the E is in the logo. That's where one of the hot spots is that both Tom's testing and our testing previously showed. 2 other spots that we post the thermocouples are, as you'll see, some of them are still hanging off here, though they've mostly gone now. 2 of the others, MOSFET number 2 and MOSFET number 7 up here, those are hot spots, and we got direct readings for those. The thermocouples used are flat and self-adhesive from Omega, as recommended by thermal engineers in the industry, including Bobby Kinstall of Corsair, whom we previously interviewed. We explained in a previous video why these flat thermocouples that have the adhesive on them do not pose issues for thermal transfer between the FETs and the thermal pads that are included on the card, and how they're not electrically conductive, so that's also a good thing. We also talked about avoiding EMI in that previous video, and that was basically the preparation video for this one. So if you're curious how the testing was set up, go there. We ran several different tests for this. There were 4 primary tests, different configurations of the card, physically or in firmware. The first one was just the card stock with the original VBIOS, less aggressive fan speed, no thermal pads applied, at least none of the extras. Second test, just the VBIOS update, no thermal pads applied. Third test, thermal pads and the VBIOS. And fourth test, which will not be in this video but will be in the article, is with the thermal pads and no VBIOS. And then in addition to that, we ran about half a dozen more tests on those 4 scenarios. And the data being published right now is primarily Kombustor's implementation of firmware and how the card responds to that, Metro Last Light and Dirt Rally on loop for a long period of time, for a real-world game example, overclocking and overvolting and the impact on the results from the previous 2 tests named, brief SLI testing, just for those of you who requested it on Twitter or elsewhere, and finally a high ambient torture test, which is probably the most interesting and will be the last one that I talk about. As for the VRM, EVGA's TJ Max is 150C and probably, one would hope, should initiate OTP at 180C. The power stages best operate at 100C continuous but have a T case of 125C. Inductors really don't matter that much for heat dissipation since they can take so damn much in terms of thermals, since they're really just copper wire coiled inside of a natural heatsink. But they do heat up neighboring components. The FETs have a thermal pad contacting the base plate, and that is included with the original design. And it's just the original cards that have no pad to allow transfer from the base plate to the heat sink, so that heat gets kind of trapped there and saturates the base plate with nowhere to go. And before getting into the testing, in our tutorial for how to apply the thermal pad mod, we saw some misguided comments about EVGA's suggested placement of thermal pads atop the chokes, basically sitting on top of the chokes and on top of the base plate and connecting to the fins of the heatsink. That would be this side of the heatsink, where obviously there's no cold plate here. If you had a cold plate, sure, it would be better, but it's not necessary. And as we'll be showing, the thermal pads between the base plate and just the fins improve the temperature significantly. So this myth that I've seen sort of circulating that they're not doing anything and it's just raw measurements or something is not true and based on nothing. And so now that we've got experience with this, dozens of hours testing it, I can tell you definitively it doesn't matter. Another thing that I saw that I'd like to debunk quickly was a concern that because the thermal pad is placed where it is through their recommendation, there's no air getting down into the VRM anymore. Well, there's no air getting there anyway because there's a base plate on top of it. It's physically obstructed. And not only that, the chokes where there is, I guess you could call it an air channel, are flanked by capacitor banks on one side which lead to the VRAM and GPU anyway, so that's irrelevant. And on the other side, flanked by a thermal pad which allows really no air transfer to the MOSFETs. So air can't get in there. And air getting to the chokes doesn't matter anyway because they can take so much heat. And in addition to that, a thermal pad on top of them has far and away greater thermal conductivity than air. Air, you might have something like 0.3 watts per meter Kelvin at 25C, where a thermal pad could be 7, could be 10. And I don't know what EVGA's pads are, but I assure you it's greater than air. I did ask them, though, what their thermal conductivity is. Haven't gotten a response yet. Oh, and one more thing. Some posts claimed that black screen issues on EVGA's first batch of cards were caused by VRM's overheating. That's wrong on many levels. A thermally compromised VRM will not throw a black screen that can be fixed by a restart. It'll go up in a puff of smoke, and you'll never be able to turn it on again. That's how they fail. The black screen issues have been resolved by EVGA and were, unfortunately to the company, another in a long list of issues and resolutions for this series of graphics cards, but they're not related, as far as we know, to this VRM thermal concerns. Anyway, enough clearing up those gripes. Let's use the data to show what's going on internally. If you have any questions whatsoever about how this testing was conducted, check the article linked below because it probably answers it in the methodology section. We're going to start with a stock card. That's with the original VBIOS and with no thermal pads applied through the thermal mod. Just a warning, this video will be very heavy on data. That's the point of it. I'm trying to sort of close the book on this series of questions about it, but that's the way it is. A lot of data, a lot of charts. Here's a table with the updated noise results. Originally, we tested the RPMs at 1500 to 1600, which was the pre-VBIOS update RPMs, and we tested that against the 2200 RPM that EVGA had informed us would be applied through the VBIOS update. After that testing, EVGA changed their VBIOS update so that the max fan speed was closer to 2000 rather than 2200, so that's the updated DBA results you're seeing on the screen now. This first temperature test is the stock card without an overclock, running Kombustor Furmark as a burn-in. Remember that Furmark is sort of a power virus. It loads the VRM more heavily than any game will ever do. Also note that Furmark doesn't blast the clock as much as the game would, but load is still heavy. The colors will be the same for every chart shown. Yellow is MOSFET 7, counting bottom up, and is a significant hotspot on the card. MOSFET 2 is a common scorch point in photos that we've seen online and is toward the bottom of the card, and that's orange. PCB is cyan and is measured on the hotspot on the rear side of the video card with the backplate on. GPU temperature is white and measured by software, and ambient temperature is also critical to these tests, so we'll leave that, as we'll later double ambient, and that's represented by a darker blue line at the bottom. We're seeing the PCB achieving temperatures just shy of 100 C after a 1-hour burn-in. The MOSFETs are both at around 90 to 94 C, with MOSFET 7 running a bit warmer. Ambient was in the low 20s for this test. Case ambient, as we show in this chart, is upwards of 40 C in some enclosures, but that would account for gains in temperature, just not a one-to-one gain. So you can't add, for example, 20 C to the results we're seeing if you have a 40 C case, like we tested in our case review this week. We'll test this situation later, though. So far, these numbers are all numbers that the card is built to handle, and that's with Furmark. Here's Metro Last Light running a burn-in. We're seeing temperatures closer to 85 C for the PCB backside and MOSFET 7, with MOSFET number 2 around 80 C. That's around 10 to 20 Celsius cooler than with Furmark, depending on what you're looking at, and other games show similar performance results. This chart shows the overclocking impact on a 1080 FTW without the VBIOS update and without thermal pads as benchmarked using Furmark. Temperatures get a little warmer here, now nearing 105 Celsius on the PCB and MOSFET number 7. That's hot enough that high case ambient would decrease your efficiency as you near 110 C, but you should still be within safe operating range as we show in the forthcoming high ambient tests. Before the high ambient tests and before applying the thermal pads and the VBIOS updates, the next goal is to test SLI 1080 FTWs with a 1-slot spacing between them. So that's basically the cards are not immediately adjacent, but they're somewhere around that far apart. It's maybe a good 1.5 or 2 inches depending on what motherboard you're using. This chart has some manual tuning in it because I was basically trying to figure out where's a worst case scenario, so there were some changes going on live during the testing. The first half of this test was without any tester interference at all. We're at around 90 to 94 C for the FETs and the PCB temperatures, with GPU temperatures maintained around 80 C, the thermal limit to which fan RPM will slave. And that triggers a fan RPM of about 80% with SLI. That's in the native profile for the cards. This is where we decided to start playing around with the idea of torture testing, and so dropped the fan RPM back to its 60% speeds from auto, so auto was around 80, and a single card would run at around 60%, so it was worth testing. This pushes the temperatures up to about 105 to 107 C. That's starting to get a little more interesting. Here's the interesting part. You may have noticed that the VRM component temperatures for SLI are actually a little bit lower than the same scenario with a single card, and there's a good reason for that. The fan RPM is entirely controlled by the GPU. The fan doesn't know anything about the VRM temperatures. It doesn't know how hot the power stages are, how hot the inductors are, how hot the PCB is, or how hot the capacitors are. It also doesn't know, well, the fan doesn't know how hot the VRAM is either. So the GPU sort of controls everything with regard to fan speed, and that was where one interesting hypothesis came about, which is if you have a hotter GPU and therefore a lower RPM, if you follow that, hotter GPU, lower RPM, so we end up with this 80% speed in the situation of an SLI test, then suddenly your VRM starts to actually look better than if you had the reverse, where maybe there's a lower GPU temperature, but there's a lot of load on the power design of the card. This is where Furmark comes in, and you end up with a hotter VRM, a lower fan speed because the GPU is cooler, and you end up with really a worst case scenario. Now it's time to move on to the VBIOS update. If you want to see how just the thermal pads perform without the VBIOS update, check the article below. Here's the first chart of the VBIOS updates. This one shows the FTW VRM with the new VBIOS applied, but without the thermal pad mod. We're hitting temperatures of around 85 C on the PCB and around 80 C on the second MOSFET compared to the stock card with the original VBIOS. This more aggressive fan speed profile improves performance by about 6 to 10 Celsius on the VRMs and about 15 Celsius on the PCB. That's just the fan profile. This is mostly the same as what we reported with the original PCB temperature testing using thermal imaging, and reconfirms our statement that the VBIOS update alone is enough to resolve the issues, though it's still good that EVGA is now shipping the cards with the thermal pads. And here's what it looks like with a video game. This is Metro Last Light at some of its most demanding settings on the GPU side, looped for a full hour. The outcome is temperatures around 75 C on the PCB and MOSFETs, and that's more than acceptable. These VRMs can handle way higher heat than that, and this is, mind you, with an ambient temperature of around 23 to 25 C as opposed to the earlier values near 20 C. This is the last chart for the VBIOS updates, at least before we move on to the thermal pad mod. This chart shows overclocking of plus 30% with the master switch engaged and overvolting of plus 100%. The VRMs are hitting temperatures around 85 to 90 Celsius, obviously warmer, but it's still an improvement of more than 10 Celsius when looking at the old VBIOS and its OC performance. Again, acceptable temperatures. A bit warm, certainly a bit warmer than some of the competitors, but acceptable and within range. Here's a look at the thermal pads in addition to the VBIOS when running Furmark and stock clocks. So now we've added those pads that EVGA ships for free. The card is way below where it was stock, somewhere to the tune of 20 to 30 Celsius, depending on which test and component you look at, furthering the decision that yes, these should be included on the cards. And temps are running around 85 to 87 Celsius for the backplate and are around 75 to 80 Celsius for the FETs, while Furmark burn-in is running. So all this data is sort of, if not for you, for me, beginning to be a bit of an overload. It's difficult just to organize it. So the rest of these types of tests will be in the article again, but I've got one more set of tests that's pretty interesting, and it is for the high ambient torture tests. The idea here was trying to kill the card actively. So this was no longer a normal use case. It entered into the realm of a challenge of how do I make this thing set itself on fire. Just to give you an idea, here's some footage of our CPU radiator dumping heat straight into the VRM fan. This is with Prime 95 running LFFTs crunching on an overclocked CPU, and with only one of the radiator fans turned on. Our CPU is at probably about 170 watt power draw during these tests. It's a lot. This is more than just a simulation of a high ambient case temperature. It's actually worse than that because it's directed airflow, not just sort of sitting air. The effective temperature that the card was breathing was often 40 Celsius of pure heat from another source of heat, which is the CPU. And I even lowered the fan RPM on the EVGA card to 50%, provided 30% more power, overvolted it 100% of allowance, and overclocked it by 125 megahertz. Another test I tried was connecting a case fan pointed strictly at the GPU, such that the GPU could run a colder temp and thus a higher clock and lower fan speed, but in a way that the VRM would still be incinerated by a lack of cool air because it's, again, directional. So that was the footage of some of this going on, and here's the chart with the outcome. None of it worked. This chart is the worst of the two. No thermal pads installed and an old VBIOS, and after overclocking around the 3000 second mark, which is where you're seeing that tick up, I was able to hit about 126.8 Celsius max on the PCB backside and about 108 to 109 Celsius on the VRMs. There was one tick to 110 that I saw but didn't really reflect in the data. The ambient fluctuation you see is from when the radiator was moved closer to the card so it would incinerate itself as much as possible. Moving on to the torture test with the new VBIOS and the thermal pads installed. The best case scenario with the worst case testing environment. The worst I got was about 82 Celsius on the PCB, and that's a massive decrease. Mostly the thermal pads doing work too, so don't listen to those comments saying that the thermal pads do nothing, because they are utterly, completely false and based on nothing. We've done enough testing at this point that I can confidently tell you the thermal pads do actually contribute fairly noticeably to performance. Just looking at the fan speeds of these two charts, you'll see that we're even below at some points the overall speed from the previous chart when I was manually tuning the cards for worst case scenarios, and yet performance was better with the thermal pads applied. But that doesn't answer for the fact that every day we're seeing posts on Reddit and overclocking forums where you're seeing, allegedly anyway, scorched or singed, or in some cases dead cards from EVGA. So why is that happening? I reached out to EVGA and got a number that I can share with you all. The number is a 200 DPPM rate for their cards. That's defective parts per million. So out of 1 million cards shipped, video cards, complete cards, they're seeing 200 that are defects and returned or repaired or replaced through the RMA process, and that is all repairs, replacements for these series cards. This means that for every 1 million, there's 200 defects. That's a percentage of about 0.02% of all cards shipped according to EVGA. I have no way of validating that. And we're told that this number is fairly consistent with previous generations. So it's just the defects, at least from what EVGA seems to think, are more noticeable this time because of the way the internet works. There's media coverage, there's people posting about issues on social media, and so now everyone posts their cards, even though maybe in the past it would have just been an email to EVGA and a replacement sent out. So it is noisier, and the 200 DPPM rate is really all I have to go off of for the answer to why do we keep seeing these things pop up if thermals are not an issue, which they are not, by the way. This testing pretty much proves it's not a thermal issue, so it's something else. Something else is going on here, at least for the 200 DPPM cards, the 0.02% of all cards shipped. Something going on, obviously, and it could just be things like manufacturing defects, workmanship, things like that. Here's a quick clip of a conversation I had with Buildzoid from Actually Hardcore Overclocking. He's got his own channel. We talk about the EVGA 10 series cards in a bit more electrical depth with him.
I'm gonna say it's the capacitors. They have a bad batch of because the one consistent thing that's like starting to show up is you have scorch marks coming. Like this latest one, it comes right off of you have the scorch mark coming right off the capacitor, right? There was a really early one where somebody had a blown out capacitor, just like capacitor completely fried in pieces. That was like the first report, and there I was like, oh no, that's just a manufacturing defect. That's not a thermal issue.
Right.
So this most recent one as well is just like the capacitors, well, it's not blown to bits, but you can see that the solder on one side of it just like got shot right off. So that one's another, like that's a capacitor failure. And basically all of the other ones are like varyingly more severe capacitor failures could cause those exact types of damage. And then along with the fact that EVGA is claiming that, oh, there isn't a thermal issue,
right,
that would line up with why there isn't a thermal issue. You have a bad batch of capacitors. So I'm thinking it's like, because I read through the capacitor failure stuff, which I gave you a link to,
yeah,
and basically all of it's going to lead to pretty much short circuit explosion sort of scenarios where the capacitor will be damaged partially. Over time it'll get worse. At some point it's going to short out and it's going to blow up. And since this isn't really temperature bound, that explains why it blows up at idle, why it blows up without the capacitor actually being like properly powered or anything, you know, the one where it blows up from the PCIe slot right at startup. Like, especially considering that the thermals, even without the thermal pads, for most people won't be that bad, right? Considering like the temperatures you showed me from the testing, that's like fine. That's normal for a VRM. Yeah. 100 degrees here, 100 degrees there is fine. It's just like, so I don't see. So it's basically, I'm almost certain that EVGA just has a bad batch of capacitors on some of the cards. Hopefully not all of them. that would be a disaster, but I think they probably just have a bad batch of capacitors and they're just going up in flames. And now it's really up to EVGA to just state probably that that's the case,
right,
like confirm it or disprove it, because they obviously don't have a thermal issue with the MOSFETs because we tortured them.
So with thanks to Buildzoid for joining for that and for his expertise, it's clear to me at this point that there's no thermal issue with the EVGA cards, at least not one that kills them. The issue is something else, and it's probably something like individual components. It might be in the supply chain. Maybe they got a batch of bad caps from their supplier, or it could be something else like workmanship or whatever other manufacturing defects. But these things are not dying because the VRMs are getting too hot. And that's even true for the stock card before VBIOS, before the thermal pads. Now, that said, obviously high temperature is not great. So it could be the case that you accelerate the death of the card caused by something else with high heat, but I still don't think that's the most likely cause. Regardless, if you have one of these now, you should still at least get the VBIOS update. It is installed through a double click and very easy, and your performance improves, at least thermally. And it's worth doing a thermal pad mod if you feel like you can, otherwise send it in or replace it with them, because the temperature improvement is just so great, it feels wrong to throw away a free improvement to that margin, especially for some of the worst case scenarios we've seen. Even though it's contacting here, you're still transferring a ton of heat from a hot component with a shell, a casing, to metal. So it's not going to air anymore. That's good, and it's free. Just apply that at least. If you don't have a card and you're thinking of buying one, at this point, there's a few things, right? There are the black screen issues that have been resolved, and I have seen those personally. And there were the thermal issues, which are really mostly a non-issue, but the sort of echo chamber of the internet is making the existing damage to cards caused potentially by other things, not thermal related, look a lot worse then maybe you would feel comfortable with making a purchase. So that's acceptable. That's totally fine. If you don't want to buy it because you're like, this looks like a lot of problems, I don't feel comfortable, then don't buy it. It's as simple as that. If you kind of had your heart set on one of these and these questions that arose about thermals made you step back and go, well, let me see how this resolves, you can probably buy it and be fine. Everything sold after November 1st will have the thermal pad replacement and the VBIOS update. Maybe there's a few items out there on shelves in small shops, but other than that, they're all updated at this point. Some were pulled back by EVGA and updated even after being sent to retailers. So I think that mostly recaps it. Assuming what EVGA told me is correct, assuming a 0.02% failure rate, this seems like a low enough occurring issue that you could buy one of these and still be okay. But that is not an excuse for EVGA's lack of thermal pads and the slack VBIOS profile, because the temperatures were way higher than they need to be. Even though it was still safe, it just wasn't competitive, and that has been fixed. So I think now we can kind of close the book on all of this. That covers every angle possible. If you want more, I guess hit the link. I'm exhausted on this topic, so we won't be covering it again. Thank you for watching. As always, Patreon link in the postal video. Do click that because it helps us fund these types of things where it basically turns into a huge research project for fun. Subscribe for more, and I'll see you all next time.